Let me personally say thank you to all of you for choosing the best breakout session. And I'm Joe Potasnick, the York Board of Rabbis. It's really it's a pleasure and honor to be with you. There's a story that's told of people who are traveling on an airline, and the movie that was showing was the Ten Commandments. Shows you how old the story is. And suddenly, with 10 or 15 minutes left at the end of the movie, and Captain announces, "I'm sorry, we're going to make the landing soon, we have to shut off the movie." And someone said to the flight attendant, "That's unfair." And she said to the passenger, "Well, haven't you read the Bible? You know how it ends." And the person said, "But you know, the movie is never like the book." So I just want to say, listen to the sessions. I think the book is one thing and the movie is another. We in synagogue world, I think we say all the right things very often, but when you leave, you may not see all the right things. As a matter of fact, years ago I went to a Quaker service which was conducted in silence. And I said to one of the ushers, "When does the service begin?" He said, "Sir, the service begins when you walk out. It's what you do on the outside that determines how sincere you were on the inside. That's why we have windows in houses of worship, because what you say, you have to see." We're very privileged to have panelists today who are very involved in the movie and trying to make a difference. And there's a lot of work we have to do. Rabbi Lev from Trua, you do some extraordinary work in reminding us that we have a responsibility to our own community and to the community at large. So firstly, let me introduce our panelists. We have on my far right Andre Ward, then we have Evie Litwok, and then Elizabeth Gaynes. I'm going to give you just a précis from their biography because we don't have enough time to tell you all of their credentials. Give them a chance to talk about who they are, what they do, how they get there, some questions, and then we'll open up for questions as well. So please, and try to keep, I know it's a Jewish audience for the most part, so usually there's Q and Q, but let's have Q and A where it's a question and they get a chance to answer. Elizabeth Gaynes, to my immediate right, President and CEO of the Osborne Association, a New York nonprofit criminal justice organization. During her 35-year tenure, she started when she was 8. The 85-plus-year-old nonprofit rebounded from a two-person office to one of the country's largest and most effective organizations seeking to transform the justice system. Osborne serves 12,000 individuals a year in 5 community sites, 30 state prisons, 7 New York City jails, with programs that include family, educational, workforce development, and treatment services. In 1986, when her children's father went to prison, Liz established Family Works, the first comprehensive fatherhood program in a men's state prison, and there's much more. Would you please welcome Elizabeth Gaynes.
Well, fortunately, he already said what Osborne does and what we do, and we didn't really work very hard on organizing ourselves, but I want to focus specifically reentry issues on how it affects families and what it's like for people to come home to families. My colleagues probably focused a little on some other areas. The first thing is I noticed in this morning, one of the panels as I was walking in, someone was talking about ACEs and adverse childhood experiences, and one of the most difficult things that we've had to face is that people think that parental incarceration means that this child is now a criminal in waiting, and that they're more likely to go to prison, which they are actually not. They do have a lot of trauma related to parental incarceration, and a lot of the work around reentry is to prepare families for that. But it's important, I want to say that I lived in lovely Park Slope, Brooklyn, where I fled after my kid's dad was arrested because when they told their friends about this, all their play dates were canceled. And then, of course, I did what any Jewish mother would do. I tried to find a psychiatrist or a therapist that would help our family, and most of them said things like, "Oh, we would treat that like any other abandonment." So there has been, now subsequent to this, their dad did 25 years, came home for 10 and died last year. But, so I'm talking a little about the reentry piece of this, but things have gotten a little bit better. We were very lucky. We did actually find one psychiatrist who happens to be married to another panelist, who was at the time Dr. Eli Messenger, who said, no, we know this is special and different, and warned me that my kids, once one parent disappears, would be like Velcro next to me for the rest of their lives, thinking that the other parent could go away. And so we worked really hard, and I know this is about reentry, but reentry starts the day somebody goes inside. And what we do with those relationships and how we manage them, it's interesting. My daughter was, when her dad was sick in his final illness and was in our home and died with us there, and people reached out to her and she said, no, they said, you never really had a chance with him because of the 25 years. And she said, no, actually, I'm very lucky compared to most kids. I have 25 years of letters where he taught me everything. We had $50,000 worth of collect calls. And then when he came home, said we both worked really hard on reentry because the damage that is done to people when they come home means in many ways I had more of him when he was in than when he came home. Partly because we thought he'd be home after 10 years, not 25 years, because Virginia abolished parole the year he was eligible. So one of the things kids and families learn is to wait and to communicate in very odd ways, and that kind of can continue even when people come home. When we established Family Works, which was this parenting program inside, a lot of it was preparing men for what it was going to be like when they would go home. And then I would get calls from their wives after they were home, because we had worked with their whole family, saying, I think he's like crazy. And I said, well, what exactly are the symptoms? And they would say, well, he's putting his clothes under the bed. I said, yeah, that's kind of how they iron in prison. Like, there are ways in which people get an institutional that families are not necessarily prepared for. And so part of this really does require a community for people to come home to. We're focusing specifically now at Osborne on an elder reentry initiative, specifically more geared. A lot of people go in, spend a very long time. Everybody wants to talk about the non-violent drug offenders and the non-violent everybody. We like the violent ones because after 25 years, let's face it, they're not, and most of them never were as a lifestyle. And so working with folks coming home, and so when we talk a little bit later about what people can and should do, it's a community which is not sufficiently welcomed and has often lost all of their ties. And so we literally pick people up at the gate, give them a cell phone, which they've never seen, teach them to use a seat belt, which tells you how long it's been since people have been inside, and then go to the dollar store and buy all new stuff, and then try to find a home.
Good, thank you.
Go ahead.
Andre Ward, I think you figured out he's on my far right, is a workforce development professional who presently serves as the Associate Vice President of Employment and Education Services for the Fortune Society. As Associate Vice President, Mr. Ward has managerial oversight of every aspect of Fortune's robust employment educational programs, including implementing a strategic vision that creates synergy and a continuum of services between the two unions. And as a member of Fortune's executive team, Mr. Ward also helps steer overall agency operation. Andre Ward.
Hi, good afternoon now. It's really interesting. I'm sitting here and I'm listening to Liz. Liz is my former boss. I've worked with Liz for like several years. Just to start off a little bit about myself. So, my name is Andre Ward. I do work in the capacity of Associate Vice President of Employment Services and Education at the Fortune Society. The Fortune Society has been around about 50 years or so. It is a sister agency to Liz and many other things to it. It's been around doing this work for a very long time. Like Liz shared, The Fortune Society also offers many different services that deals with every touch point of a person's release from prison. One of the most notable things that we have at Fortune is our housing. So we do have transitional housing, and we have that kind of support for people coming out. As we know in New York City, there's a tremendous amount of not having access to housing, not only just for people who are formerly incarcerated, but people generally. And so with our transitional housing, we do support people coming out of the prisons and jails with those opportunities. My story is really interesting. You know, when I think about the work that Liz has done, I think about the opportunity that I was given. I served 16 years of my life in prison. I was released January 16th of 2009. I came home, I had no education necessarily. Of that 16 years, I would say maybe 15 of those years were really committed to transforming my life and developing it in a way that I could be an asset to my community rather than a liability. And so when I came home only with a GED, I went into school. College became really important to me. I did study many years in prison, just reading and etc. And I went on maybe 5 years, earned my master's degree in social work. I'm a social worker by profession. I'm an adjunct lecturer. I teach at Meg Evers College in Brooklyn. And I share these things not to arrogate to myself importance, nor to deem myself an exception by any means. There are many formerly incarcerated people who, because of their relationships with organizations like Fortune and Osborne, because of the opportunities that we have been given to be employed at those agencies, are really doing some great work in the world. So that's like a loose kind of like way of sharing like who I am. In terms of employment, we'll talk about that a little bit later. We know that even though the Fair Chance Act has been passed for people having access to employment opportunities, some employers are still not honoring that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Evie is our next presenter. She sent me 2 wonderful videos. By the way, take a look at them. Make sure you give me your contact information. But one of them shows a reunion with her mother. And she walks in, she looks at Mom, and she says, "Mom, you shrunk." Right? And Mom looks at her and says, "And so will you." Evie Litwok is the founder and executive director of Witness to Mass Incarceration, acronym WMI, a non-profit organization devoted to raising public awareness of conditions within the nation's prisons and ending mass incarceration. WMI uses documentation, leadership development, grassroots organizing, and advocacy to make impact. Litwok left prison homeless, jobless, and penniless in 2014. Despite the lack of resources, she began speaking out about her experiences there and formed WMI in 2015. Litwok formerly worked in the financial industry and holds an MA degree in psychology from Temple University. Evie Litwok.
So I'm going to give you a little background on me and hold the reentry stuff for later. And some of you, I apologize, who are in the room have heard this story. You know who you are. So I am a formerly incarcerated Jewish lesbian and a child of 2 survivors of the Holocaust. And I say that because each of those intersections played a big role during my incarceration. I was in 2 federal women's prisons, and I spent time in solitary confinement. In 2009 and 10, I was living with my mom. She's 93. She's still with us. But she back in 2010, when I was living with her, she really didn't see well, didn't walk well, and I was her 24-hour caregiver. She went before my judge, and she said, "I'm a Holocaust survivor. I have had all the pain I want in my life. My daughter, without her, I will die. She does everything for me." And the judge said, "Your daughter's a monster. We're sending her to prison." Leaving my mother with no caretaker. When I was unpacking, you unpack for prison. You take off everything and you walk into prison with as little as possible. My mother walked into the room, and very serious with her walker, and she said, "I want to talk to you." Okay, I stood up, and she looked at me very seriously and said, "Prison's going to be harder for you than concentration camp was for me." And I looked at her, I said, "Are you crazy? You were in Auschwitz. How could you possibly compare the two?" And she said, "I was 12, you're 60. And later in solitary confinement, I remembered the rest of that conversation, which was, I was a child. I didn't know what was going on. You're an old woman. You've had an entire life, and you're going to remember everything from your life every day. And she was correct. The moment that you enter prison, you know that you're no longer in the free world. I was taken to a cold and dingy room with an officer. I had to strip naked in front of her. I had to pee in front of her. I had to lift my breast so she could check for contraband underneath it. And then I had to bend over and cough so she could check my vagina and my anus that I had no contraband or drugs. And at that moment, when you're bent over during your first strip search, you are more humiliated than at any other point in your life. And at the same 10 seconds that you're bent over, you are keenly aware that whoever you were on the outside, you have to close it up, shut it down to survive this experience. So when I came, prison was a nightmare, but reentry was worse. And I say this to you because we have thousands of people coming home and reentry is worse. So I was put on a Greyhound bus, given $30. I arrived at Port Authority to no one. My mom wasn't well enough to help me. It was an overwhelming experience for someone who grew up in New York, always was at Port Authority, to find myself sobbing and being aware that I felt lost. And that was a feeling that I knew I never wanted another person to feel again. And that stays with me today. I was homeless and penniless for 16 months. I understood poverty for the first time when I had to make a choice. I had $1 whether I'm going to eat a 30-cent bagel or a piece of pizza. The people who are home are starving. They have no money, but I'll get into this later. I am one of 700,000 or 600,000 people that come out each year. One. In the New York City area, thousands, sometimes tens of thousands we're facing are going to come home. If RAP, release aging people, is successful, 2,000 people over the age of 70 are coming home. There are no homes for them, there are no jobs for them, and they are not even able to work. So that's a separate issue. I like to be very realistic about it. I formed Witness to Mass Incarceration to place the voices of women and LGBTQIA people at the front of the battle to end mass incarceration. I've focused on conditions of confinement, sexual violence in prison. There is no Me Too movement behind the bars. It's an important issue, but the issue that I think is even more important is reentry. The Suitcase Project is a collaboration between Witness, a synagogue, and members of a synagogue and a newly released person. We're very fortunate to have CPST and SAJ. What we did is we asked them to raise $2,000 for a suitcase, which contained a computer, a phone, minutes for a year, and $600 worth of gift certificates. 1 month. 1 month of MetroCard, unlimited, some food, clothing, and toiletries. But that lasts literally 1 month. There is nothing coming to them in month 2. So when I realized how wonderful it was that we made sure to meet them at a train station so they weren't alone, so we gave them a way to communicate, and we gave them just the beginning of something, I knew that there was much more needed. Because of the 3 people that we helped, 1 is back in Rikers, 1 is selling drugs, and 1 is doing sex work because they cannot get jobs, period. So I launched a program just recently called the Jewish Response for Reentry. This is a witness program where I'm going to focus on 4 areas with pragmatic things, like the thing I mentioned upstairs, which was a rotating brunch. Something anybody can do, and it's going to be around 4 areas that I consider the most important: housing, employment, mental health, which is a very, very important area because we are traumatized when we come home, and community. And anyway, I'll stop.
Thank you. All right, questions. I'll raise a few, then please feel free. I think a question that permeates the conference, our hearts, is what can we do? You know, I heard the word repentance before, tshuva. But I thought to myself, repentance is two-way. Yes, there are those who've served time and they're repenting or have repented, but we as a community, I think we also have, because there are things we didn't do, right? And really have to fess up and say, we've contributed to the problem, what more can we do? So I'd like to hear from you, looking at the group, looking at the conference today, give us some specifics, some takeaways that you think would make a difference in terms of communal involvement. All right?
So I'll say three. One is to not be fooled by this bipartisan thing. David Koch is opposed to healthcare, and so when they say that all these people agree about criminal justice reform, they're really not talking about anything significant, nor was the First Step Act particularly significant. And so part of it is just to be skeptical about what you hear and think in terms of real reforms and bringing it there. Secondly, Congregation Beth Elohim and St. James Church have for many years participated with us as we fly kids from JFK up to Albion to visit their mothers, and have done all kinds of work around focusing on children who have incarcerated parents. And it's been like a joy and a pleasure, and those opportunities in that general area exist. We do a lot of work in our Brooklyn and Harlem office around with families affected by incarceration, both before and during and after reentry, and so there certainly are volunteer opportunities. The other thing is I was talking about older people coming home. And Andre, I think, will talk about generally what we do around employment. And we have whole volunteer days, like Goldman Sachs does a day in all these capital places, and do mock interviews and work with people on their resumes to come home. The other thing is a lot of aging people coming home from prison, they can't be released unless they have a guardian, someone who's willing to be their healthcare proxy, their executor, even when they have nothing. The prison sometimes will hold somebody who has any cognitive impairment because they don't have a guardian. And so that's another concrete thing someone could do, would be to meet somebody. Also, we are in prisons and we can bring people to visit. I would encourage you to stay in touch with us and come see Rikers Island if you haven't been there. Come to Sing Sing or Bedford or Taconic. Because that is something that is a witness, someone can do.
We at the Board of Rabbis, we also work together, obviously with chaplains, we oversee many of the chaplains, but there's a volunteer project where people go, but you have to go through an orientation process. You can't just walk in and say, I'm here. So I would suggest, following up what's been said, that if you want to be a volunteer, you can contact the board or contact Osborne, and we'll give you concrete steps about becoming a volunteer. I can tell you this, you know, for many inmates, there's no family. Well, the family lives far away, so they welcome. Just as in a hospital, very often you welcome a visitor, they welcome someone to sit down. I remember I met Judy Clark.
She's home.
She's home.
She looks great.
Yeah, and I remember sitting with her, and I walked away feeling enriched. I don't know what she felt about the visit, but I walked away saying this was an experience. So being there face to face is something that's important. Andre, you and I spoke. I mentioned I think it'd be important for the faith communities to form an employment bank. Talk about jobs.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Super important, Rabbi. You know, when we're talking about employment opportunities, each of you in this room has some sphere of influence and have relationships with some entity that involves like business, etc., to some degree, whether it's directly or indirectly. And so giving people an opportunity, not just to be employed, but maybe an internship opportunity, is critically important. What we do, much like at Osborne, Fortune, we have a simulated work environment. When our folk come into our space, they come into a job readiness workshop for 2 or 3 weeks to give them the workplace socialization skills necessary, obviously, to go into the workplace. But critically important to that is some kind of bridge to really get into the workspace. People, many of whom have come from prison or jails, have never been employed before. So getting an internship opportunity is very, very important for them, because they can go into this experience, learn some things in preparation to go into the workplace. In addition to that, as an employer, it's almost like it's free labor to some extent, right? And a way by which to give back to the community and to support in some way these internship opportunities. So that's really important. coupled with this idea of volunteering is mentoring. So while Fortune also has a really robust volunteer component where we have folk who are former professionals or still are doing mock interviewing work, we also have a robust mentoring component where the very professionals of whom I just mentioned are also mentoring a lot of the people who come through our doors, which is really, really important. So I think that's one thing, Rabbi. The other thing is really engaging us as subject experts, right? We have an analysis, we have an understanding by virtue of our experiences to be able to support you in partnership to inform other people, right? I know Rabbi used the term inmate. And so one thing we are on a strong campaign to do is educate as subject experts. We don't use language like inmate or convict or prisoner to describe people who've come out of jail or prisons. We call them people. That's all. People who are in prison, people who are in jail, people who are formerly incarcerated, to humanize people. And so that's one thing, consulting us, engaging with us as organizations. Our CEO, Joanne Page, is a big proponent, as is Liz, and others about this idea of language and words mattering. And so we're major proponents of that. And so partnering with us to gain some more knowledge in how we communicate in the world, what we do, is important. And the last thing I think is if there's financial support that's available, that's equally as important to our work. We rely heavily, as Liz can tell you, and my colleague here can tell you, on city, state, and federal funding. And we know through the procurement process, right, it's almost like a held up process. And I'm sure maybe Liz, you can speak to this idea of like we're waiting for funding to come to us that doesn't come oftentimes when we have contracts executed in some instances, right? So that's one challenge for us. So funding is also a really interesting thing for us too to get support with. And I'll just stop right there.
In terms of community engagement.
Okay. So what I want to say is, I think the most important step is for the synagogues to invite formerly incarcerated people in to have a conversation. You need to be exposed to who we are and what we're dealing with. And the best way to do that is to meet us. And it doesn't have to be a formal panel. It can be, like I said, one idea was a rotating brunch where you bring a bunch of people in. But we are not. We have been through prison. And you come out with very little opportunity. I mean, there's a percentage of people who come out and can go to Fortune and Osborne, but there is a large percentage who disappear. And my concern is for those who disappear, which is there's 95% of the people in prison come home. People only see a fraction of who comes home. So if I was to give you an example of the position we're in, if you've probably heard that immigration detention, they're spending $750 a day providing to take care of each child or each person. And I have to laugh because they're not giving them soap, they're not giving them food, and they're not giving them bed, so what the F are they doing with the money? Whereas we walk out with $30 and people think we can survive that way. If it costs you $750 a day or $100,000 to keep us incarcerated, then we need to have people come out to have a year of financial support. There has to be a trust for each person coming out. We have to figure out where to get this money. This is not through individual fundraising. Each person needs $30,000 to survive their first year so that they don't have to live in a shelter or walk the streets, so that they can have an apartment, so that they can eat, and someone else pay their bills. We need practical solutions. We need people were very generous with me sending food to me, but they never asked me what I wanted to eat, nor did they ask me if I could cook it. Mm-hmm. So when I say you need to meet the people are at various. You want me to stop? Okay.
No, I think it's important. You know, I know sometimes we have conferences on millennials, how to reach the millennials. But I often think, why don't we hear from the millennials? They should be telling us some of the things that they value. So face-to-face to me is critical because it also reduces the stigma.
And my proposition would be that any synagogue that wants, I'd be happy to bring a group of formerly incarcerated people to have a conversation where you can ask them how they feel, and they feel overwhelmed. You need to hear how difficult it is for us to survive year one.
All right. I have another question. Why don't we open it up? I think a lot of you have questions, so we'll start from the back. Go ahead.
Should I stand up?
What's your name?
Kara
Kara.
Ferber.
Question.
Hi, my name is Kara, and I am the Advocacy and Policy Director for an organization called Pink Concussions, and so we do research and advocacy and education about the impact and awareness of concussion and traumatic brain injury on women, whether it's from domestic violence or from assault or from the military or in sports or in motor vehicle accidents, and often there hasn't been enough research and awareness done in that. So I guess then my obvious question, is that I'm sure that in prison there is violence, there is probably a significant amount or occurrence of concussion, of accidents like that, and how much like mental health, any evaluation, anything done upon release in terms of, or access to care, in terms of that. So is there any, I guess, awareness or treatment or, evaluation,
In the prison?
either within prison or like before, upon release?
Yeah, if I could extend that just a bit, we get a number of complaints from those who are incarcerated. Let me say it properly. I've been watching Hogan Heroes for too long, that's why I can't. But one of the complaints we get, and it's recurrent, is the mistreatment by prison guards. And what is told to us is the following: I'd love to report the prison guard, but you know what's going to happen. The minute I say anything, there's going to be retaliation. So now we're having more body cameras, but still, guards know, where there are areas in the prison that cannot be, where you could violate someone without having it on camera. So that's another part of that equation. So talk about that, Kara's question, and also the behavior of the guards.
I'll let Andre talk about the officers, but but it's interesting. My kid's dad actually came home with traumatic brain injury that had never been diagnosed inside, and in fact, incarceration was almost like it never showed inside. The assumption that good psychiatrists have made who work inside the system is that we should assume the same diagnosis for everybody, which is PTSD, and that whatever traumas people have had before or the process exists, and there is not particularly treatment unless you consider the fact that puppies behind bars and people having dogs and those kinds of pet therapies, people are actually training those animals for veterans who have PTSD. So the answer is obviously there's very limited treatment inside. We could write books about it. In fact, many people have, and it's particularly true for older adults who are experiencing other kinds of cognitive decline. Usually it could be related to early injuries. There's not much, there's not like going to be a lot of neurological testing. New York State is a little bit ahead in the sense that we have a cognitive impairment unit, a long-term care unit, hospice, but the real solution is to get people home. And one of the things we haven't talked about really is your ability to influence legislation that would have elder parole, where people who are older could be released much sooner, because a lot of it is going to be related to their need for medical care. Social Security will not, Medicare are not allowed for people who are on parole. They can get Medicaid but not Medicare while on parole, which is a stupid policy, right? And so, a lot of long-termers wouldn't be eligible because they didn't put in enough quarters. But the point is that, and it's hard to get people into nursing homes and assisted living. So even when they diagnose it, it's very hard for people to come home. We've had a lot of people who parole basically said, we're not going to release you because there's nowhere for you to go where you can get the correct nursing home medical care.
I mean, the other factor is that with traumatic brain injury.
You're going to take some other questions, all right?
Oh, I can't just say, no, it's just, well, it's not a question. I just wanted to say that it causes like impulsivity and disinhibition and a lot of issues that probably would cause, recidivism, so.
Autism also undiagnosed.
And it causes, in addition, it causes dissonance, right? Because you're in this kind of environment where these forces kind of militate against you while you're in there, right? It's an abnormal environment to begin with. And so you're trying to normalize that experience as a means to survive. It causes dissonance. That causes all kind of like psychological and physiological kind of challenges as well. But from my vantage point, there's no real like true assessment, right, to engage one's like diagnoses, right? They don't have like biopsychosocials necessarily, nor do they have like an adequate amount of social workers that are on site right, or capacity to engage people in that way. And so to Liz's point, of course, the goal is just bring people home, let them get acquainted and get connected with the services needed to really engage their psychological kind of challenges, et cetera.
Okay. You want to talk about the prison guard behavioral?
Yeah, so in terms of like the guards who are there, many of whom obviously had their own stigmas before they even come in, and I would maintain are racist, right? And from my vantage point, and so when you had those two elements that exist, right? One, stigma; two, the idea of being racist, and then you're in a position of authority and control, it breeds all kind of abuse. Almost akin to like that of the Holocaust, right? You had people in positions of authority and power have a perspective on other human beings and treat them in very inhumane and disrespectful kind of ways. So it's similar in that kind of way. And so there's no real training necessarily for law enforcement or the officers who are there to engage people in a real humane way. Oftentimes, you know, there's a group of people coming from the same communities, have a similar perspective on the people who are incarcerated there, and they'll continue to treat them in really inhumane ways.
Okay. Evie?
So we are property of the feds, or we are property of the states, and it is there because we are considered property, and they take your Medicare away from you because supposedly and allegedly they provide you with these health services inside. So they're responsible for our health, our mental health, and it doesn't work. I'm going to give one example of what goes on. We could give a million examples. I work now with a trans woman who's in a men's prison who was raped and as a consequence developed HIV. So instead of her sentence in prison, she now has a death sentence or a difficult life sentence. And getting medications for that, it doesn't happen every day. So we cannot talk about reentry the day someone leaves. It cannot be that way. The minute somebody walks out of prison without a plan and without an assessment of without something truly developed, they are screwed. They are.
All right. I just want, you know what, there are a number of, why don't we do this? Let's, each of you ask the question, then we'll have them touch on it. Question?
The question is, you mentioned right away, Ms. Gaynes, this notion of the child not having to be like the father, and that's a very strong belief for me when I worked in the courts, and I would see, just be in the park, dad's going for arraignment, and mommy and the child, and I've so felt, it's been so strong in me, that there was no choice for that child, and you brought it up right away that it doesn't have to be. So give me some hope, take the belief away. That's it.
Question?
Mine's for Evie. I work with the Refoundry, which is a great reentry program, and one of the things I'm learning from the ex-convicts that are in the program is
Formerly incarcerated.
Sorry.
Formerly incarcerated.
Formerly incarcerated. Thank you. Is that they come out not only not being able to get employed, but they have a tremendous amount of fines. And can you talk about what that is, and if you had those two?
All right, question, Jones? Question?
Question, yes. When someone comes out of prison, everyone agrees that the most important thing is to have some occupation, someone to help them get a job. We in the Jewish community have, let's say, 1,000 congregations. Rabbi, do you have some mechanism or some programs working with congregations that have plenty of job opportunities within the congregations?
Well, that's what, yes.
Okay.
We
So
talk
my
about
question is
publishing
really to you.
a job bank. We all,
Like
we
a
all,
job bank.
right, we
to
all have
create-
access, right.
To create a job.
Right, okay. And there was one other person, I think, who had a question. Yes, question?
For Mr. Ward, I understand we all choose to come to the panel on reentry. But when you're talking, I'm so brought back to the initial kinds of, what happens that creates the trauma within communities, and the fact that people don't have, it's multi-layered, but the fact that someone maybe is never employed, doesn't have a connection to a job before crime is committed and they're sent to prison. So is the Fortune organization?
Fortune Society.
Society, thank you. Are they also doing at that, young adults training, education?
Sure.
I'd love to hear a little bit about that, just because it's a little more hopeful.
Sure.
All right,
Thank you.
last Question,
Here's a question.
brief question.
It's
Brief.
just, we touched upon this in the general session earlier about the, how difficult it is in terms of the laws that people who come out are caught in catch-22, and how you might change some of that stuff, like they can't go to their parole appointment because they're working, and then they end up recidivating because of
Last-
something
last-
like
last-
that.
So you talk about connecting with people who've been formerly incarcerated. Is there a means for that that people can know about? Is there some kind of pipeline so that people can identify people? Because you may know those people, but just to ask them.
All right, we got 5 minutes. All right, go ahead. Eddie, what do you
I'll
want?
try to hit on what I can remember. Job bank. We can't just create a list of jobs for people. It's more complex than that. We have to send in a questionnaire with, I'm in the process of working with several, Witness is in the process, my organization, of working with synagogues to design a questionnaire to send into synagogues so their members can answer. And remember, people are coming out who've been in prison 2 years or 36 years. So it can't just be a job bank, it has to be thoughtful, because we have to match people up and screen people for jobs. It's not as simple as, I need a file clerk.
So there isn't failure.
I'll take one, like, just to add something to that. I think job banks are critically important, to your point, right? We've just built a relationship with Rob Cotton from New York, New Jersey Port Authority to do some work there, and we're working with JFK and LaGuardia, and this whole huge job bank, right, that we have access to. For us, and I'm sure with Osborne and other organizations, the goal is to prepare people for an opportunity. Right? We had many people that are coming home from prison and jails that have various skills. Some have experiences, some may not. Our goal is to train them with the requisite kind of hard skills credentials, OSHA 30-degree building maintenance operation, environmental remediation training, with these industry-recognized credentials to prepare them to go strongly into the workforce. So we really, really need job banks. Right? We have serious challenges. I know from the vantage point, something maybe from Osborne and Fortune, we don't have enough jobs for our folk, right? We have a lot of people. We offer them a lot of different trainings to prepare them to get into different sectors, but we don't have as many job opportunities that we'd like to match them to those opportunities. So we'd be happy to engage, as I'm sure you and others, to build something up like that.
Like he said, on that's good. And the big areas for our folks tend to be hospitality, construction, and human services. But we'll take any job, we can always match somebody. I want to say something about your hope, right? So the truth is that people who stay connected to their families are 6 times less likely to go back to prison. So supporting children and families. The reality is that while these kids might have the same chances of going to prison as other people in their community, it is not the fact of their parental incarceration that makes that true. What works for those kids is what works for any kid, which are adults in their lives, resilient opportunities for things. That's why we work with kids at every age. And then as they get older, we work with them on going to Albany and going to City Council and advocating for a number of bills, which are up here, supporting free visiting buses and lots of ways to keep families more connected. Kids who stay connected to their parents, because nobody is in prison telling their kid, I want you to follow in my footsteps. That's just ridiculous, and part of what's pushed back around visiting and lots of ways of supporting kids. We've taken literally 100 family court judges to show them our family centers in the prisons and how the visiting goes so that they will stop thinking that it's bad for kids to stay connected. And we've been pretty successful. So there's a lot of hope here. And as long as the Jewish communities continue to volunteer to deal with our own racism and the racism against Jews, and begin to educate this whole community of folks about it, I think we can really be proud of what our contributions are.
Before you all go, I just want to say one of the things that we're proud of in New York are the relationships we share with people in the non-Jewish community. We have constant dialogues, trialogues, meetings with those of different faith communities. This is not, it's a Jewish concern, but it's a general concern for all of us. I would just leave you with this one thought. I read a while ago that in the Orient, the weavers are told if they make a mistake while they're weaving, they can't remove it. They have to integrate it into the pattern. There's a lesson there. There are certain scars and scratches you can't remove. But I think what we can do by working together is try to transform those scars, those scratches into designs so that people formerly incarcerated can begin again. Thank you very much.
You want to